last lecture for Unit 7. This is our art impulse for Unit 7, and on this one we're talking about the impulse to study. And this art impulse is a little bit different from some of the other ones that we've done because this is less a reason why initially people make art and more sort of something that people wind up doing once they get involved in art. I mean, I think there is some examples of people who pretty much devoted their life to art because of the desire to study things, but it's more often the other way around, which is someone's interest and desire in the arts and becoming an artist and becoming better as an artist then leads them more and more to observing the natural world and to studying things to make sure that they really understand the things that they're making art about. So that's what this lecture is about. And one of the things that kind of like is a lead into this lecture is the fact that we're talking about perspective. And perspective is a perfect example of kind of a scientific endeavor about studying the way we perceive the world that is fundamental and critical to so much art, but it's very much a very, it's not exactly scientific, but it's very close to a scientific way of studying because we're basically, when you study perspective, you're studying in a way, you're studying perceptual psychology. You're studying how our brain perceives the world, how it diminishes things as they go further back, and why. And so, we have seen examples of artists who have really taken the study of perspective very seriously, as insanely seriously as Thomas Eakins is here, where he is using a perspective system for figuring out the changes of the size of the um, of the waves on the river. I think actually in the actual painting, by the time he got to finishing the painting, he was much more loose and intuitive about deciding about those changes of scale in the waves. But I think you can see some hints that he probably started the painting following that perspective grid system. So one of the things I want to lay out or discuss is the fact that I think studying the natural world has been a major part of art from the very beginning. I mean, to a certain degree, going all the way back to the cave paintings of Lascaux and Chauvet, we have seen that artists put a value on understanding the natural world, making a drawing of a lion or a woolly rhinoceros, and doing it accurately, like so that they feel like it represents the thing that they observe in the natural world. It represents it well. And here's a really good example of that. And I think it's kind of interesting because we sometimes think that artists in general will be more realistic and more accurate about the things that they know well. But it is actually the opposite, which is that here in this painting where we have a pharaoh hunting birds, and there are all these different species of birds represented here, the artist is extremely naturalistic and specific and accurate about all these species of birds. But when it comes to representing human beings, the artist is following a much more stereotypical convention. So less accurate and less specific. And I think oftentimes artists are more accurate and specific when it's something that they're not being told how it needs to be represented. So in this case, because these are all individual species of birds, the artist can kind of come up with the idea of how to represent it by themselves from just looking at specimens of each bird. Um, so here's some other examples. Um, Here we have a Durer from early 16th century, and then here we have Edward Burne-Jones, a pre-Raphaelite from the 19th century, but both doing a very similar thing, which is you have a dead bird. If you happen to own a cat, you probably acquire dead birds pretty regularly. I don't know how Durer and Burne-Jones acquired these dead birds, but you have a dead bird and then you say, I want to see how this wing works. And you start doing studies, whether it's drawing studies or painted studies. Durer was definitely an artist who was really passionate about studying the natural world and just about studying things, that he really saw it as integral to his process to really carefully study the things he was planning on making artwork about, but also just to carefully study things, just whatever he was interested in. So if he was interested in, a stag beetle, then that he would, he would do drawings of it. He would do small watercolors of it. He would study it until he felt like he really understood it. And this watercolor here, which we don't know what the title was originally, but the title that is often referred to as A Great Piece of Turf. And one of the interesting things about it is that botanists have looked at this painting and realized that there are like hundreds of species of grass and other plants in this one painting, each one carefully and accurately represented. And many of those species of grass and plants no longer exist in any part of Germany. They're completely extinct in that part of the world. And so it's kind of an interesting thing to see Durer paying that much attention uh, to those details. Landscape painting itself began as a form of study, um, something that people did as part of their travels. When artists would be going from, to another part of Europe, they would bring small pieces of paper with them, and they'd make studies. They do watercolor studies to view, to kind of remember where they went and just notice the differences. So it's very much the very roots of landscape painting begin with kind of a study approach. And another thing that's really important, I think, in this kind of history of artists um, seeing art as being built on study and really using like careful study as kind of part of their process, is the idea of the sketchbook. The sketchbook really is a product of the late Gothic and the early Renaissance. And by the time we get to Leonardo da Vinci, keeping a sketchbook was considered a very normal and expected thing of all artists. And da Vinci also, some of you may know, he kept his with notes, and the notes were written backwards as a way to, a form of a cipher to prevent other people from copying his ideas. But in his sketchbooks, he studied everything. He studied anatomy, but he studied all kinds of things. He studied machines that people were making and machines that he was just imagining making. He studied everything he could to just better understand the world. And tying in with that interest in anatomy that really begins very heavily in the Renaissance, we have, as we move into the Baroque and all the way through later European art, we have this connection between artists and the study of anatomy, and the study of anatomy not just being hiring live models and drawing the figure from life, but also being involved in dissections. It became a common thing for artists to be friends with groups of doctors, and that they would, kind of attend each other's, or the artist would attend anatomy dissections put on by doctors. This was, and we see this both in the Baroque all the way into the 19th century. And um, so, but there are other things that artists have studied that are less obvious. And here's one. John Constable was a landscape painter, but some of the most beautiful paintings he made are these studies, these very kind of quick oil sketches that he would make. He also did watercolor studies as well of just of clouds, and he studied clouds so carefully that pretty much like all of the types of clouds that are scientifically cataloged are pretty much represented in his study. And it definitely fed into his work. When you look at his landscape paintings, you can really see that understanding of how clouds are structured in his work. That's my 1 minute warning. So I'm going to end on this page, but I just want to say that I think actually, for Constable, his cloud studies are actually, for me, his most satisfying, his most beautiful paintings. They're his freshest paintings, and they have the least amount of sentiment. They're just purely acts of observation and acts of painting, loose and gestural, but not trying hard to be loose and gestural, just being as loose and gestural as needed to get the image that he needs to get. All right, we're going to end there. I'll see you in